Amy Buckman. I'm the Manager of Public Relations and Special Events for Philadelphia Media Network, the publisher of The Inquirer, The Daily News, and Philly.com. We're the folks that pulled this event together this afternoon, and I am 100% sure that we are going to be hearing some very interesting conversation as we go through this afternoon and evening. The conversation will be about voter anger and its impact in the 2016 presidential election, and we want to make sure that it is a conversation. So that's why when you came in, you found little cards and pens on your seat. As you're listening to our speakers, we want you to jot down any questions that you might want to ask the speakers. We're going to curate them and pass them along and make them a part of the discussion as we go through the evening. It would be great if you could put your name on there and maybe what town or neighborhood you're from, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can as we go through the afternoon and evening. And it's very important, we couldn't do events like this without our sponsors. So I just want to take 1 minute to thank our sponsors who helped pull this together for us this afternoon. They include our host, the Independence Visitor Center, who not only arranged for this great room, but also for fabulous weather out on the terrace, where we'll be having our wine and cheese a little later. That's having cloud, I think. The Liberty View Ballroom, which is our location, and Brule Catering, who will be providing for us said wine and cheese later. And now we really do want to get underway as soon as possible. So it's my huge pleasure to introduce to you the publisher and CEO of Philadelphia Media Network, Teri Egger, to say a few words.
Boy, she does a wonderful job. Just very quickly, on behalf of my wonderful colleagues at PMN and our great board of director members who are here in our audience, we just wanted to welcome you. It shows a lot about your character, your interest in this subject, your interest in this community, and being here. You know, in the small world category, just prior to getting this gig, I was actually the CEO of the Cleveland effort to get the Republican National Convention to Cleveland. So finished that, came here and got the DNC and got to be a part of that as well, so it's a thrill. I also want to remind you that in the Daily News, The Inquirer, and Philly.com, from now through the convention, through the elections, that is going to be the best source for unbiased coverage of all the issues that are important to us, not just nationally, but also specifically here in the Philadelphia area. And we thank you for your interest and support of our journalists and their efforts as well. And finally, I'd like to thank our panelists who are here, taking their time to be with you tonight, and our wonderful people in the marketing team who pulled this event together. So on behalf of all of us, we want to welcome you. We hope you enjoy it. And please do engage in the conversation. That will make it a much better evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Teri. Our next speaker that I'm going to introduce to you has a name that may be familiar to you if you read the Daily News. In particular, Sandra Shea is the editorial page editor of the Daily News. She's also our director of strategic partnerships. She's the one that works with so many of the really important organizations in our community so that journalism and those important causes in our community can join hands to make where we live the best place it possibly can be. Sandra's going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate this audience because I think you have the hottest ticket in town for this year, maybe since the Pope delivered Mass at the Basilica last year. And of course, it's a hot ticket not just because of the relevance of the subject, voter anger, and I do hope you appreciate our efforts in making sure the Brexit vote happened a week before this event, so it would be extra interesting. It's also a hot ticket because of our speakers and panelists, any one of whom would be well worth the price of admission. But we have such a lineup tonight, and I'm not going to spend any more time keeping you from hearing what they have to say. You'll hear more about who they are in a moment, but I first want to introduce our featured speaker. I had the pleasure of working with Michael Smerconish years ago when he wrote a Daily News column. And that, in fact, was so long ago, I think he was still a Republican. You know, I was thinking about what I would say very briefly, and I had to think about the dream award for an actor is called an EGOT. It's Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. And I think that Michael has the journalistic equivalent of an EGOT. He dominates radio, television, print, and online with his columns and observations and analysis. He's one of the more interesting thinkers out there and also just a great guy. So I am very pleased to introduce Michael Smerconish. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Good afternoon, everybody. If the 2016 election were a movie, you know what movie it would be. It would be Network. Hopefully you remember, it was 1976. Peter Finch won an Academy Award for Best Actor playing a fictional television newscaster named Howard Beale. He's wet, he's disheveled. He arrives in the studio late one evening and he launches into a monologue. I don't have to tell you that things are bad. He begins by saying, everybody knows things are bad. And then comes the ask. He asks everybody to go to the window of their home, their apartment, throw up the sash and say, I'm mad as hell and not going to take it anymore. Thank you. And they do as instructed, and the cityscape becomes this cacophony of angry voices. And so we are led to believe is the 2016 election landscape. Only I question the storyline. Because on more than a dozen occasions during primary and caucus season, I was an election night commentator for CNN. Anderson Cooper would moderate our panel. To my left was Nia Malika Henderson, David Axelrod, and then Gloria Borger. And if you watched us, you may have noticed that when the camera was not trained on each of us, our faces were buried in our laptops. And in our laptops, we were looking at tips from sources, we were looking at email, we were looking at our Twitter feeds, and we were looking at election exit surveys of voters who had just cast ballots. And the information that was supplied to us and supplied by other media outlets was provided by the Edison Media Research firm. And it's from that data that this storyline of voter anger emerged, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, and it became a constant. I remember well the night of February 1. It was the Iowa caucus. Republicans cast their ballots, and they were asked how they would express their feelings toward the federal government. 42% said angry. 49% said dissatisfied. Of the remaining 5% said satisfied, and the group I'd most like to meet, the 3% who said enthusiastic. Interestingly, Democrats were not asked that question in Iowa. My hunch is that if they had been asked to express their feelings about income inequality or Wall Street, you would have seen a similar result. 1 week later, February 19, New Hampshire, Republican voters asked the same question. This time, 39% said, I'm angry. The Democrats were asked, and the Democrats in New Hampshire said 12% in comparison to the 39%, we're angry. South Carolina, 40% of Republicans. March 15 in Florida, 40% of Republicans. Each of these expressions of anger, I won't run through the whole electoral calendar, but it was a constant. And it became a constant in the media. As a matter of fact, if today, I've done it, you were to Google Republicans and anger, you'd get 30,600,000 hits, which is 10 million more than if you put Democrats and anger into a search engine. But along the way, I grew suspicious of this narrative. And I grew suspicious of this narrative because in my day job, I answer the telephone. And I take telephone calls from voters all across the country, and I wasn't feeling the vibe of anger. So one day on my website, I asked the question, which better describes your mood? There were 1,662 votes that day. It's not a scientific poll, but 1,662 is sufficiently significant, I think, that you have to draw some conclusion from it. 68% said hopeful. 32% said angry. Maybe you're thinking, well, that's a reflection of the people who either listen to my radio program or are willing to call on the phone or cast a ballot. Except 1 week later, on April the 2nd, Lynn Vavreck, who's a political science professor at UCLA, wrote on this subject for the New York Times Upshot column. And here's what she wrote. Data on the nation's economic recovery, people's reactions to current economic conditions, and their overall sense of satisfaction with life do not suggest that Americans are angry. In fact, historical measures indicate that people are about as happy and satisfied with the economy and their lives as they were in 1983, the time period of Ronald Reagan introducing mourning in America. She cited the Index of Consumer Sentiment, one of the longest-running measures of Americans' views on the economy, which showed that by the end of 2015, consumer sentiment was nearly identical to where it had been in 1983. And she looked at the General Social Survey, which since 1972 has asked Americans to take stock of everything in their lives and rate their level of happiness. The 40-year trend showed only modest levels of changes and some small increases in happiness in recent years. So what accounts for the disconnect that I think exists between exit polls and headlines and social science? I'm here to argue that it's indicative of the outside influence, the outsized influence in our political process of the most passionate among us, those who are most participatory in the process, versus the rest of the nation. Pew Research has documented the influence of passion, noting that it rests on the edges of the political spectrum. And that's where you find the people who are most actively involved on Election Day, who write the checks, who put a bumper sticker on their car, are willing to have a fundraiser, or to hang a yard sign. And this appears especially pronounced on the right. Drew DeSilver, a senior writer at Pew, analyzed the data from the 2012 election and found that conservatives are the most politically active among us. His analysis showed that 82% of conservative Republicans are highly likely to vote. That's the highest percentage of any political subgroup. And they also seem to be paying the closest attention. In 2012, 80% of conservative Republicans said they followed public affairs or government some or most of the time. That 80% compares to 73% of liberal Democrats and just 67% of the general public. Don't misunderstand. I don't deny that anger exists in the electorate. I just believe that the loud voices of those who are angry have muted too many of the rest of us because we have let them. I also think that I know how we got here, and I've written on the subject, both in the Inquirer and at length at CNN.com with Brian Rosenwald, who's a PhD at Penn, earned his PhD by studying talk radio. Ask yourself this. How did the Republican Party end up with its final competitors being a scornful, extremely conservative senator so unpopular among his colleagues that not a single one endorsed him, and a bombastic businessman who's never held elective office? The favored status of Donald Trump and his final competitor, Ted Cruz, I think is actually unsurprising when viewed in the context of those who really hold political power in today's GOP, the mostly men with microphones. Over the course of the last 3 decades, these media personalities have surpassed party officials and even elected representatives in their influence, ascending to the exalted status of being atop the Republican Party. And yet, they prioritize goals that are seemingly at odds with the party itself. Political parties exist for one reason, not to be ideological vessels, but to win elections. But business motivates the titans of talk. They aim to maximize revenue from advertising, which requires that they attract computer clicks and ears and eyeballs. And how do you do that? You say something provocative. And the politicians, I argue, have taken a page from the handbook of those entertainers. When viewed against this backdrop, there's nothing surprising about Ted Cruz having once said, "I think President Obama is the most radical president the nation has ever seen," considering that Glenn Beck got great traction when he said Barack Obama is a racist with a deep-seated hatred of white people. And similarly, Donald Trump's claim that Megyn Kelly had blood coming out of her wherever is hardly surprising considering the traction that Rush Limbaugh received when he referred to a Georgetown Law Center co-ed named Sandra Fluke as a slut. Talk radio and cable television news also did a lot to push many conspiracy theories that Trump hints at and slyly pays homage to. He embodies the ethos of talk radio while also voicing the grievances that have animated talk radio conversation for decades. Here's the irony. Many of these same hosts that I argue created this climate of conflict are now deathly afraid that the candidate who won their side of the aisle is about to take a drubbing in November. This is a partial explanation, I think, as to why Democrats have won 4 of the last 6 presidential elections and the popular vote in the 5th. Because while the Republican Party has proven very effective at controlling Congress and state capitals, the ever-increasing power of its media leadership has made control of the White House elusive. If there's a new silent majority in the nation, it's not Tea Party activists, it's not millennials who are feeling the burn, it's the tens of millions of Americans who are not angry, but too complacent, remaining silent and politically inactive. Consider that in 2012, 16%, only 16% of voters participated in a primary or caucus. This year, there's been increased interest, but Iowa, a state where you could go and meet any candidate if you'd chosen to do so in your own backyard, despite all the commercials and all the attention from the eyes of the nation, 180,000 Republicans, 170,000 Democrats cast their ballot. That's a mere 1/5 of the 1.6 million Iowans who voted in November of 2012. And it's an even smaller percentage of Iowans eligible to vote in a general election. So my conclusion is that those who have participated, especially on the right, are over-reflective of anger in America. And Donald Trump has been the beneficiary. Remember I said 42% of Iowa voters said on Election Day that they were angry? At a time when Donald Trump had 12 competitors, he won 30% of that category. 39% in New Hampshire said angry. Trump won 44% of them. South Carolina, 40% angry. He got 44% of them. Florida, 40% angry. He won 59% of them. And here in Pennsylvania, 38% of Republicans who cast ballots on our election day said they were angry. Donald Trump won 66% of that vote. Whether there are enough angry voters to propel him to victory, I say is a different story. I'll bet you've heard that Donald Trump received more votes in securing the nomination than any other Republican running for president. And that's true, historically speaking. All told, Donald Trump received 13.9 million votes this primary and caucus season. But he also set a record for the number of votes cast against him. If you tabulate the number of votes cast for one of his opponents, that was 17 million. That too set a record. In fact, I think of June 7, which was the date of the California election. Unless you consider the District of Columbia, it was the last night of voting in the country. And by then, he'd vanquished all of his opponents. And still, a full 25% of California Republicans went out and cast a ballot for someone other than Trump. Pew Research said that roughly 57.6 million people, or 28.5% of eligible American voters, voted in 2016. And Trump won 24.1% of the total votes thus far cast. That's confusing. Let me simplify it in one sentence. Said differently, he has won only 6.9% of the votes of eligible voters. So he needs to build on that anger significantly and put it in recent historical terms, because he garnered nearly 14 million votes. Barack Obama won re-election 4 years ago with 65.9 million and was elected in 2008 with 69.4 million, a record. He's got a lot of ground to cover. I don't think he can do it unless he expands beyond an angry constituency. So the question moving forward is whether that anger will continue to have an outsized influence, or will the influence be diluted by general election voters who tend to be more racially and ethnically diverse, more female, and more young. And of course, perception can become reality. If the coverage continues to highlight the views of the angriest among us, portray them as if they're more omnipotent than I think they really are, then the perception might take further hold. Additionally, there are steps that can be taken to lessen the influence of the angriest among us. I want to leave you with 7, in addition to some that hopefully you're have in mind on your own. Number 1, overall, participation needs to increase. We need to make it far easier, less onerous for people to vote. When more participate, they dilute the extremes among us that otherwise limit our choices. Secondly, more open primaries. These enable independent voters more influence and don't limit their choices to picking among the candidates selected by the ends of the spectrum in primary season. Third, professionally drawn boundary lines. Nate Silver at the 538 blog has written on this, I think, effectively. He notes that in 1992, 103 of our congressional districts were competitive. Competitive defined as the presidential race will be decided within 5 percentage points. That number today is 35. It means that the outcome of the presidential race is predetermined in 400 of 435 congressional districts because of the way in which those boundary lines have been drawn. Fourth, we need campaign finance reform. Maybe we can't overturn Citizens United, but we can demand full and immediate disclosures of all donations in real time via the internet. My objection is to the lack of transparency. If you haven't read Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, I recommend it. It explains how so-called 501c4 organizations can say they're devoted to social welfare and engage in politics with no sourcing of contributions. That's simply unacceptable in the internet age. Fifth, we can change sore loser laws. Former Congressman Mickey Edwards has written on this subject. There are 44 states that block a candidate who fails to win a party primary from appearing on the general election ballot, which I say deprives us of a full complement of choices. And here's my favorite illustration. 2012, Texas, the Senate primary, a habitually red state. On the Republican side, David Dewhurst, who's the relatively, by Texas standards, moderate lieutenant governor, wins 46% of the vote in a multi-candidate field. A Tea Party favorite was second in the balloting, receiving 33%. But where Dewhurst didn't get the requisite 50%, it necessitated a runoff. And in the runoff election, the Tea Party candidate beat Dewhurst, but only 630,000 Republicans voted in a state of 26 million people. In the fall, Dewhurst was prohibited from taking on the Tea Party candidate and the Democrat in the general election because of the law that I mentioned. And thus, the road was paved for Ted Cruz to win, go to Washington, and shut down the government. Sixth, in the presidential election, we need to expand debate participation. Gallup in January said 42% of us are ayes, in comparison to 29% who are members of the Democratic Party and 26% who said they are Republican. When it comes to picking presidents, the ayes have it. But unfortunately, they're not represented on the debate stage, and if they were, I maintain they would force a candidate on the left and the right to defend his or her positions against the center. Finally, seventh, we need to recognize that entertainment choices have consequences. And more of us need to be willing to change the channel. You want news? Read the Inquirer and the Daily News. If you want entertainment, well, you know where to go. Finally, with regard to these 7 steps and any more that you can think of, we need to hurry. And I want to tell you why. No hands. Just think about your answer. How many of you would be displeased if a son or daughter came home and said they were marrying outside your party? not your race, not your religion, your party. When the candidate was asked of Americans in 1960, only 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said that they would be displeased. When asked in 2010, the number had grown to 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats. A group of Stanford and Princeton researchers were intrigued with this. They wanted to conduct an experiment. Their conclusion after conducting the experiment was to determine that political ideology today exceeds racism. And the way they got there was to show 1,000 individuals fake resumes of individuals they were told were high school students competing for a scholarship. And each one of the resumes had racial and political cues. If you saw a resume from someone who was the high school Republican club president and his name was Thurston Howell III, you had a pretty good image of who you were dealing with. What they found was that partisanship mattered more than race. Most rewarded members of their own party, even in a circumstance where a competitor clearly had better credentials. So, the anger that threatens Washington based on ideology and partisanship is metastasizing. And now is the time to take back control of our political debate. Remember, when Howard Beale went to the television studio and asked Americans to shout outside that they were mad as hell, many of them followed. I say it's time for the rest of us to close our windows. Thanks very much.
I'm going to ask our panelists and moderators to come on up, and as they are doing that, I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. The moderators tonight are a political dream team. Dan Biddle is a politics editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and an author with Murray Dubin, hi Murray, of an early book about an early civil rights activist. And John Baer, a colleague from the Daily News, is the voice, the conscience, and the brain coming out of Harrisburg, and his astute and insightful and very funny analysis of what's going on in Harrisburg for the past few years has been critical to this city as well as this state. So I welcome both of you, and also I think they're going to have the panelists introduce themselves.
Did you say critical to or critical of?
Yes, I did.
I think it was critical of.
I forgot. I'm sorry, Governor. Yes, both. Thank you.
Who's that adorable John Baer? All right, let's get started. First, we're going to have each member of the panel very briefly tell you who they are. Keep it short. We got a lot of ground to cover.
I'm Melinda Henneberger. I'm the editor of Roll Call in Washington. If you're not familiar with us, we've been around for 60 years, and we cover politics and concentrate on covering Capitol Hill.
My name is Farah Jimenez. I'm the child of immigrant. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Yeah. My name is Farah Jimenez, and I'm the child of immigrant parents who came to this country in pursuit of religious liberty, and who taught me to understand that their beautiful blue passport was a golden ticket for hope and opportunity, and that even as brown-skinned and non-native English speakers, that they could pursue their dreams and their children could as well. So you may have already garnered that I'm a Republican, because I drank this Kool-Aid as a kid, and I have formed a career that is about fighting for the preservation of these values through my political involvement in the Republican Party and through my professional involvement as an advocate for the most vulnerable populations. I've worked for nonprofits that serve formerly homeless families, kids who are struggling for quality education, college access, and communities that are struggling to come out of blight. I am a Republican who believes there are bipartisan solutions to every problem, and that bipartisan solutions are the best. And I've made it my life's mission to model that by marrying a far, far more attractive James Carville to my Mary Matlin.
My name is Solomon Jones. I am a Philadelphia native, lifelong Philadelphian. I am columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, as well as a radio host for 900 AM WURD. I'm not as radical as the radio host that Michael Smerconish talked about a little bit earlier. You won't hear me saying anything about women that might be offensive since they hit me when I do. See? I am also an author. I'm a novelist. I've written 8 novels, crime novels, which are set in Philadelphia, and 2 short story collections as well. So that's me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ed Rendell. I write a sports column for the Daily News.
All right, that's a couple of tough acts to follow. I'm Dan Biddle. I'm the politics editor at the Inquirer, and I aspire to write 8 novels. I think I'm supposed to throw out the first question. As politics editor, every presidential election, I'm just fascinated by what actual voters tell reporters. And I'm a great believer in what a late great politics writer, David Broder, said, that any reporter could always gain insight by just getting a group of American voters together and talking with them long enough to hear what's on their minds. And any reporter who's ever worked with me knows how strongly I feel about that. And every election, I feel like I land on a voter quote of the year. I remember back in 2000 when our great politics writer in those days, Dick Pullman, went to South Carolina with the McCain for President campaign. And you all remember what had been in American politics right before that election. At one McCain rally, Pullman got a hold of a guy who sells furniture for a living and said to Dick Pullman of the Inquirer, "These issues, they come and go, and frankly, they give me a headache. All I want is a straight shooter who won't sleep with his intern." I thought that was the voter of the year in 2000. Well, I want to give you a voice from a story that we did in the spring before the Pennsylvania primary this year, when for once, you know, we had the luxury of the Pennsylvania primary being important in the presidential race. Our great current chief politics writer, Tom Fitzgerald, along with a couple of other reporters, collected a bunch of voter voices, and we're particularly interested in a trend line that had been seen in a few states and cropped up in Pennsylvania before the primary. A lot of Democrats, and remember, this is in Pennsylvania where registered Democrats far outnumber registered Republicans right now. A lot of Ds had switched to R before the Pennsylvania primary, and we wanted to find out why. Lucky for us, there's decent transparency around voter records, and an enterprising reporter can go to a county seat and get a list of people who had switched. So we did that, and I'm going to read to you what a woman from Narberth said to our reporters. And this is a woman who had switched. That's how we came up with her name. "I'm scared to say it," said Bonnie Ann Alder, a registered nurse, "but I'm a Trump supporter." Alder, 51, is from Narberth, in the heart of the vote-rich Philadelphia suburbs that both parties covet. A longtime Democrat, she switched to Republican last month out of deepening frustration with the cost of health insurance, among other things. She thinks Trump will stand strong against terrorism and for middle-class people like her. These are her words. "I'm a hard-working person with a master's degree, and my health insurance from my company is absolutely terrible. And when I hear Obamacare is funding immigrants who don't have jobs, let alone green cards, it's very frustrating." So for the panel, and I'm going to start with Farah for no particular reason. How did all of us bright people, the pundits and the political leaders, miss the anger of a former Democrat like Bonnie Ann Alder?
So I think it's partly because I think in part we're still missing the genesis of that anger. And I have a four-part response, if that's okay. One is that I think historically we've already created kind of a baseline for this new model of politics. Our what used to be purple speech, which was bipartisan in nature, has become increasingly red versus blue speech. So I think it started when people were accusing Bush of lying as a premise for which we got into war, and then followed by Joe Wilson and you talking about screaming from the congressional floor about Obama lying, saying you lie, for that very premise that the Obamacare was not supposed to support illegal immigrants or immigrants. The other is we've eased into our ideological corners, as Michael mentioned, with the MSNBC and Fox 24-hour news cycle and the defriending and unfriending on Facebook. And we've been willing, unfortunately, to paint our political opponents as enemies versus adversaries. And that has gotten further, and increasingly as a Republican who's involved, what I hear from people who have chosen to switch parties is they're frustrated that political correctness, which was at some level tolerable, has given way to free speech victimhood with this talk about microaggressions and safe spaces, where it happened to sticks and stones. May hurt my bones, but may hurt me, but words will never hurt me. The battle of ideas has given way to battling our enemy. So we blame one percenters. We tell people that those others should pay their fair share. We tell them they didn't build it. And we have a continual use of straw men, which is a favorite form of speech of our current president, which is there are those who would say, fill in the blank, but clearly if you want to be on the right side of history, you should frankly agree with me. And then I would say the concluding point is the constraining of liberty in the guise of expanding justice, so that we must be compelled to abide by your mores when they violate my own faith and religious liberty in the form of contraception and abortion and Obamacare or baking cakes for gay marriages. There are those who would say, as a law-abiding citizen, why must my right to bear arms be constrained when I believe the restrictions you propose are not going to make us any safer? And why must central government be allowed to force me into a bathroom-going conversation with my 9-year-old, require me to buy health insurance, require me to bake a cake, to celebrate an activity that I don't abide by? Why must central government force me into these ideological changes? The way that we used to do this was slow and methodical in a bipartisan way. And unfortunately, I think that cultural warfare and cultural struggle is really at the root of the Trump ascension.
Solomon Jones, has Farah got it right? Is cultural warfare why voters like Ms. Alder sound so angry this year?
No, I don't think so. I think that, you know, what I know about Donald Trump, I know from going to Atlantic City, and or as my wife would call it, Atlantic City. But I like to go there because the shopping is good. They've got great outlets. But what I see there is an outline of Trump's name on the side of casinos that have closed, costing thousands of jobs. And so when I hear him talk about his love for various groups of people, I love the uneducated, I love the middle class, I love the workers. You know, I just think about what I see when I go to Atlantic City, the outline of his name on these closed casinos that to me represent the jobs of thousands of these people that he claims to love. And to me, it's nonsense, it's laughable, frankly. But I think that the people who say that they love his rhetoric, and I'll agree with Mr. Smerconish on this, love the entertainment more than they love the facts. He is a reality show star who has turned the presidential election into a reality show. I'm going to take issue with what Farah said around being slow and methodical with change. Slow and methodical allowed Jim Crow to go on for decades in this country. Slow and methodical allowed people to be discriminated against because of their ethnicity in this country. And so you'll pardon the younger generation if they don't want slow and methodical, because they are the ones, especially the ones who look like me, young black men, are 21 times more likely to be shot by police than their white counterparts. And so slow and methodical for them might cost them their lives. And so the anger is not only on the right with those who support Donald Trump, but the anger is also on the left with those who believe that Hillary Clinton is moving in a way that is slow and methodical, in a way that is more centrist than they would like. And so they believe a guy like Bernie Sanders, who have a lot of respect for, interviewed him face to face, nice man. But he was in Congress for 25 years, and the things that he's talking about doing now, he didn't do when he was in Congress. And so, you know, we have to, I think, on both sides, really take a look at who is Donald Trump really, who is Bernie Sanders really, and figure out who is the person who can really lead this country forward in a way that is fast enough to keep up with the change that's occurring outside the political spectrum.
Let me just suggest, in the interest of time, that not everybody answer every question. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Let's just try to keep our answers as succinct as possible. And Governor, I want to follow up on something Smerconish said, which is really interesting, and that's how ideology is splitting us as people. And that dovetails with a Pew Research Center poll just last week that said, for the first time since surveys dating back to 1992, majorities in both parties expressed not just unfavorable, but very unfavorable views of the other party. And today, sizable shares of both Democrats and Republicans say the other party stirs feelings of not just frustration, but fear and anger. Now, Smirk says we need to take back the debate. How do we do that?
Well, first, just to quickly answer Dan's question, we shouldn't be surprised about the anger. The anger on the right was manifested by the Tea Party in 2010, and the anger on the left was manifested by the Occupy folks. That anger was there way before the election year started. John, what was the question?
This split in ideology that has extended now not just to people in the parties, but to people, period.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'll try to be succinct. Never one of my long suits, but you know, I think people answer these surveys in an odd way. I agree that John's survey, that was probably the answer of people, and yet if you ask people, do you want the Republicans and Democrats to cooperate and get things done? Overwhelming. 75% say yes. Those two things don't seem to compute. So I think people have feelings that fit into different columns and different boxes. And if we had a president who could lead and bring people together and bring both sides together and get things done and work and try to reform the center, I think that president would be overwhelmingly popular, notwithstanding the poll survey that John talked about.
Danny?
I'll throw you another one. I was at a book event the other night, and an African-American woman, my age or older, learning what I did for a living, said to me, when Trump says, "I'll make America great again," don't you think what he's really saying is, "I'll make America white again"? Melinda Henneberger, you've done some of the best voter interviews I've ever heard or read.
That's kind.
Are you catching that vibe out there from African-American voters? And is there something to what that woman said to me?
I personally feel there is something to what she said, and you certainly do hear that. I believe that a lot of the anger is more cultural, to put a nice word on it, than economic. But at the same time, I also talked to African-American supporters of Donald Trump. I talked to several recently at a rally in Richmond, Virginia, where what I kept hearing from African-Americans, admittedly small group, but they were saying, you know, immigrants to this country hurt African-American workers the most. And so that's not a new feeling, but I think that is something that you definitely hear. I mean, I was telling you before, you hear all kinds of people who are coming together for, as you say, this entertainment. And I think that anger has become entertainment. His angry shtick is entertainment. And I think when people see that modeled, not only on cable, on, as you say, talk radio, on social media, from the candidate, it's a cool thing, you know, that saying, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. I think that that's sort of seen to be something that is a sign that you're paying attention now, that we have forgotten how to speak to each other in a way that is at all constructive. I mean, like I see in Congress every day, even on matters on which Democrats and Republicans agree, nothing happens for reasons that are very difficult to understand.
Would you please share with this group the story you were telling some of us at lunch about the voter who mentioned that he might have a part of building the wall?
So I was talking to this man at one of the Trump rallies who is from Mexico and came here illegally many years ago himself. And I say, and you're supporting Trump? And he says, yes, because now the people who are coming over are way more dangerous than when I came over. And, you know, now some of them might be terrorists. They're not nice Mexicans like me. And so, you know, so we listened to the whole Trump rally, and, you know, it's all about the wall. And so I went to him after the rally, and I said, so, lots about the wall. What are you thinking now? And he says, well, I can't talk too long. I got a wall to build, and I got a wall to pay for. So.
Farah, let me toss one at you on the electorate. How on earth is the American electorate ever going to take politics and voting seriously again? After the last cycle, 2014, we had the lowest voter turnout since World War II. And this cycle, we're listening to people running for the presidency of the United States, talking about college free for everyone, deporting 11 million people, and penis size.
How are we going to take it seriously?
How are you going to take it seriously?
Well, I guess the hope is that we'll learn some lesson after this election cycle, because there are, as more than 50% of the electorate is going to be unhappy with regardless of which person gets into the White House. It's not like the favorable ratings for Hillary Clinton are strong, nor are the favorability ratings for Donald Trump. So most of Americans are going to be deeply dissatisfied. So my hope is that we'll learn something about how we want to work together as a nation after the 4 years of our next president.
One for Governor Rendell. You know, once again, we're in the aftermath of another shooting massacre. And every poll I've seen shows the vast majority of American voters want some gun laws that will limit access to assault weapons and will create stronger background checks so that people who are mentally ill or have criminal records have a harder time getting their hands on firearms. And yet nothing moves in our Congress. A debate that my wife and I used to constantly have, and I just am itching to hear Governor Rendell's thoughts on this. What explains that? Is it the financial and political muscle of the best-known gun lobbying group, the National Rifle Association? Is it that group of voters, and Mike Smerconish, I think, rightly pointed out, that the people who really rule in American elections are the ones who trouble themselves to do that thing of honoring all the people who fought and died for the right to vote by going to the polls in an election? Well, the NRA's people, gun owners, are great at turning out and voting for someone they like or against someone they don't. What is the equation, Governor? I've heard you speak eloquently on this back when you were governor. What is it about our electorate that makes it impossible to pass gun laws that every credible poll says most of us support?
Well, this is going to be hard to be succinct, but I'll try. First of all, the system in Washington and in most legislatures is broken in the sense that bills can't get to the floor unless the people in control of that house or that chamber bring them to the floor. If you brought the background check bill to the floor of the House, it would get about 40 Republican, maybe 50 Republican votes, easily enough to pass. Who are those Republicans? Well, they're Michael Meehan, they're Congressman Fitzpatrick from the Philadelphia suburbs, there's Charlie Dent from the Lehigh Valley. They can't afford to vote no, because in their areas, gun safety is a huge issue. It's a huge issue, and they can't buck the voters. But we never force them to vote because the Speaker controls the calendar. And plus, we have two rules in Washington that absolutely eliminate any chance of the people's views prevailing. One is the filibuster rule, which is not a part of the Constitution, is not a part of any law or passed by the Congress. It's a part of the Senate rules, and in fact, it can be changed. Harry Reid changed a little of it. We should get rid of the filibuster rule. It is anti-democratic. We would have gun control legislation out of the Senate today if 51 votes passed a law. We can't get to 60, but we can get to 55. We can get to 58. We can't get to 60. Secondly, in the House, there's something called a Hassert rule. But after what happened to Speaker Hassert, I think they're looking for another name for it. But it was the Hassert rule. And the Hassert rule said that the Speaker of the House will not bring a vote to the floor unless 50% of the Republican caucus is for it. So let's take the issue of immigration reform. The Senate actually did something bipartisan on immigration and got over the 60 votes needed for filibuster. If that Senate bill had gone immediately to the floor of the House, it would have passed because 40 or 50 Republicans would have voted for it. Almost all the Democrats would have voted for it. It would have become law, and we would have solved one of the nation's thorniest problems. But the Hassert rule allowed the Speaker, in this case John Boehner, to say 50% of my caucus is not for it, we're not bringing it to the floor. So we've got to get rid of the Hassert rule. I think there should be a taxpayer's suit saying that the filibuster rule and the Hassert rule violate one man, one person, one vote. I think we should do that. And if I wasn't such a unfortunate gadfly, I would file a suit myself. So that's number one. And on gun control, Michael Bloomberg said it right. On the first, after Sandy Hook, we didn't get the Senate to pass reasonable gun control, the background check legislation, because 5 Democrats went south. Michael Bloomberg said to New Yorkers, don't contribute to their campaigns when they come asking for money. Because if gun control is going to get anywhere, we have to become the single issue voters that the NRA is, the single issue contributors that the NRA is. Kelly Ayotte, smart, reasonably moderate senator from New Hampshire, voted against universal background checks, even though the Manchester Guardian poll showed 91% of New Hampshireites, 62% of New Hampshire NRA members were in favor of it.
And why do you think she did
Because
that?
she's afraid that the NRA will target her.
And that will mean what?
She'll have a tough primary fight. She might win that primary fight, but it'll weaken her and she'll lose to a good Democratic candidate like Maggie Hassan.
Because
they're single issue voters.
Right.
I don't think they are. I ran twice in Pennsylvania, the state that has the second largest NRA membership. I won by 10 points and I won by 21 points.
To look at the influence of money in politics and in what you're talking about on the gun issue in particular, I mean, there is such a straight line. We looked this week in roll call at all of the Democrats in the House of Representatives participated in the sit-in over gun legislation except 11. There were only 11 who did not, and 4 of the 11 got money from the NRA. So others had things like a dead sibling and a serious cancer diagnosis, but most of the people who weren't there were people who had cashed the checks.
But I'll just add, too, I was thinking you were going to go a different place with money, because money also plays a role. And anytime there's a friction, particularly around gun rights or gun restrictions, or sometimes around abortion, whatever the matter of the day, is each party starts to fundraise around that. We all get these email blasts saying they're going to take away your guns, or they're against restrictions on guns, they're evil, give me money. So there isn't this kind of fundraising that's about getting to the collective voice, as Michael would say. It's about drawing our lines even more brightly. And I would say that if we want things to really change, it always has to be a Nixon goes to China approach. The Republicans have to introduce the gun legislation. They need to be supported by Democrats, and Democrats need to take a step back. And when it's an issue that's really relevant to Republicans, the Democrats really need to lead. I think that's the only way we're going to get ourselves through these thorny issues.
Solomon, we've got a convention coming here to Philadelphia in a couple of weeks. Both parties have some odd, some would say rigged ways of picking convention delegates, which of course then pick candidates. Should the experience of this cycle encourage changes in the party delegate process? Is such change even possible? And more broadly, does this cycle finish off major parties in terms of picking our candidates?
I don't think so. I think that the change that you've seen in the political process is due to technology. It's the same thing that's changed the newspaper industry. It's the same thing that has changed civil rights battles, and it's the same thing that's changed politics. Social media has changed the way that we do politics. You can react quickly and instantly to anything that anybody says and does and take away their platform and make it your own. We just had a guy do that named Ernest Owens. He's a young reporter from Philadelphia who commented on Justin Timberlake's comment on Jesse Williams' speech at the BET Awards. And I had him on my show today. He was in the Inquirer yesterday because he took to social media and instantly had this response. The same thing is happening with our politics, I think. And I think that Bernie Sanders supporters used social media to deadly effect against Hillary Clinton. You've got people going around saying that Hillary Clinton is a murderer because of what people were saying on social media. You've got people going around saying that she's the devil because of what people have said on social media. And so I think that more than the delegate process, I think it is the process of how we do media, how we communicate with each other that has the potential to change the way that we do politics.
I was just going to say, I think we are under the illusion that we are a democracy, we're a republic, and that means we elect representatives, and the representatives, even though we cast our vote, in essence, this election is about electing representatives, which are delegates, who go forward and either abide by the party rules around how they have to cast their votes, or the party rules may change at the convention, allowing them to be freed from those constraints that were designed in last convention, 2012. Yeah, there may have been more votes cast for Donald Trump, but there is definitely the Never Trump crowd that is looking for their Hail Mary pass with some changes to the rules at the Republican convention. I find it very unlikely that the rules will be changed, but there will certainly be some really interesting machinations in July.
We're just a minute or two away from audience questions. Let me squeeze in one more debate for Melinda, and one more question for Melinda and Governor Rendell. Presidential debates have always made me crazy. They've taken on a Hunger Games theme. If media is truly going to serve the public, why not have debates without live audiences when you can actually see what people know rather than who can spit out the best applause line? Or are we just simply doomed to politics as entertainment?
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. We are doomed to politics as entertainment. John is absolutely right. The debate format, even in the presidential debates when there are only 2 or possibly 3 candidates, you still say, okay, what are you going to do to revitalize the economy? You have 90 seconds. Ludicrous. Ludicrous. It's just entertainment. It's just sound bites, and sound bites prepared by some staffer who anticipates a question. The best thing I ever did in politics in terms of a debate wasn't actually a debate. When I ran in the general election for governor in 2002 against Mike Fisher, a very good Republican, a smart, decent guy, NPR, actually it wasn't NPR, but the Pennsylvania Public Television, put Fisher and I in a studio with one moderator for 90 minutes, and the moderator asked us the same 10 questions. We were separate. Same 10 questions, and the moderator gave us 9 minutes to answer each question, and of course he interjected with follow-up questions. At the end of that 9 minutes, you had a good idea what the candidates were going to do about the environment, whether they knew their stuff or didn't know their stuff. It was terrific in terms of really finding out what the candidates stood for. Did they know their stuff? Did they exemplify the type of leadership that you wanted? And the ratings were pitiful.
Governor, I like that format. Will you recommend a debate format like that be suggested by your candidate this year, Secretary Clinton?
I mean, it would be great.
One-on-one with Donald Trump?
No, it wasn't with the one-on-one with the candidates, because they would ask the gotcha questions of all time. It was one-on-one with a serious moderator, Michael Smerconish, who asked good questions and asked good follow-up questions and didn't let someone give platitudes. Donald Trump, how's he going to get the economy revitalized? He's going to make good deals. Well, what do you mean by good deals? Well, he's going to get China to knuckle under. Well, how are you going to do that? You know, it's unbelievable. 9 minutes is a long time, folks. You really get to know whether someone knows their stuff.
One thing that I hear a lot is about anger at the media and why aren't you, from all sides, and of course from the candidates, and that's only correct because we're supposed to have this relationship that's full of tension, this adversarial relationship. But things have changed so much in terms of access to candidates and people who are in office and seeking office feeling like they have to answer to the voters through us. So it's a lot easier for them to do a Facebook town hall than to sit down with someone who's going to ask them tough questions. I really get a little frustrated hearing, why aren't you and your colleagues asking tough questions? If you're known as someone who asks tough questions, you're not going to get that interview. I mean, there's really not that feeling because voters so give off to me the message that you don't have to sit down with the media. They don't represent us. So that isn't happening. A lot of those tough questions never get asked or answered, and you practically have to be the blood relation of a candidate to get the interview. And that's different now.
Audience questions.
Right.
So I've given you audience questions if you have some more.
All right.
And we can toss these to anybody who wants to take them.
Yes.
So here is from Kevin in Flowertown. Was there a proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, which turned the word compromise into a dirty word? Was there a proverbial last straw? Nobody. Melinda.
I mean, I think about the Tea Party. When I think about, the lack of compromise now, when I was growing up, you had Democrats and you had Republicans, and they compromised on, whatever. That's how the legislative process works. You put a bill in, the bill goes into committee, they make some changes, it goes back, it goes to the other house, they make some changes, it goes back, they agree on everything, and then it goes to the executive, and then it passes. That's the way it's designed. It's designed for compromise. But I think with the rise of the Tea Party, and frankly, I think that with the election of President Obama, the first black president, there was a lot of anger and resentment that you could really trace back to that. I heard one voter say in an interview, I was never racist until they elected President Obama.
Let me jump in and say I agree with Solomon. Particularly, I think the succinct answer is Barack Obama. Because let's look at W's time as president. If you were to ask W the three most momentous things that W did, going into Iraq, the war in Iraq, almost 80% of the Democrats in the Senate supported the move to go into Iraq. Bush tax cuts. 35% of the Democrats in the Senate and the House supported the Bush tax cuts. Medicare Part D. About 80% of Democrats supported Medicare Part D. Those were the three of the four or five biggest. No Child Left Behind. Who was the Democrat who stood with President Bush? Ted Kennedy. So we didn't have this ideological split that tore us apart when W was president. And then Barack Obama comes in, this young, good-looking guy who happened to be African-American. And all of a sudden, we got 3 votes in the Senate and none in the House for the stimulus plan, a plan that basically saved the economy. The Democrats got badly outspun about stimulus, but the truth is, stimulus saved the economy. Secondly, we got how many votes for Republican votes for health care, the ACA? None. Where did it go? George Bush got plenty of Democratic support for all his major initiatives. Barack Obama got none. You have to go a long way to convince me that the color of Barack Obama's skin was not a factor. I'm sorry to say that.
I
have a different, I'm sorry.
I do think that redistricting was a straw that broke the camel's back on compromise, because now I always have people asking me, now you know that they don't really oppose that. Why are they doing it? Or something like, people will say, why did they have the 99th hearing on Benghazi? It may or may not have been about the issue itself. It's because people fear a primary. They really have to play to always worrying about somebody being from their own party. They can't be seen as working with the other party. And that's a lot of it. I agree with you.
Yep. Okay, I really like this question. This is from Elgin in media. And it goes to one of the things that Michael Smerconish mentioned. If we can't overturn Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that undid about 100 years of restriction on political giving, none of this matters. Exhibit A, Trump. Exhibit B, Clinton. How do we remove money from politics?
I'm sorry, how much money did Trump spend to win the Republican primary?
Virtually nothing.
Virtually nothing, right? He was on CNN, he
Right.
was on MSNBC. Again, you know, technology, media changes the game. It's not just about money.
Right. Think about how much free coverage Donald Trump got on television, networks, cable, as opposed to Lindsey Graham. And I will tell you, Lindsey Graham is a substantive guy. He has some good ideas. He is actually not a bomb thrower. He said at a forum that I was at a couple of weeks ago up in New York, they asked him if Hillary Clinton won, would he try to work with Hillary Clinton? And he said, of course I would. I'm American first, a Republican second. He got about 1% of the coverage that Donald Trump did.
Blame the media.
Well, the media deserves to be blamed in that one.
Anybody else? How are we going to get money out of politics? I wonder if it's possible.
No. It's a First Amendment issue, no.
Yeah.
Audience question. Does the most obvious demographic of the present in this room, baby boomers and up, who are white, have significance in the angry discussion? Are we all really angry? Well, I'm in that demographic. I can tell you I'm always angry.
And I can vouch for that.
I'm not a white baby boomer, so maybe there's someone else who'll answer.
Well, I'll say quickly, I think the premise, how many of you read Michael's Sunday article that sort of was the lead into this? It was a very good article. I don't think the electorate en masse is as angry as we all think. And Michael gave a stunning statistic, which I wasn't even aware of. If you take the Iowans who voted in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party primaries, 2 hotly contested primaries, it was less than 1/5 of the registered voters of the state of Iowa.
Is Iowa a closed state?
No, Iowa's an open state.
Independents can vote in
And let me
Iowa
say this. If they were angry, they sat on their keisters and didn't come out.
Well, don't you think
It was cold. Iowans are used to cold.
Ed, don't you think part of the angry is people not voting?
Maybe. But, you know, Donald Trump always talks about it. He got the highest number of votes ever in a Republican primary season, 13 million. Well, memo to Donald, you're going to need 65 million to win the general election.
Yeah,
Still in all, the keys to vote. The voters
Well,
who
but the
sit
interesting
at
thing
home.
is, Bernie Sanders got 13 million votes. So there's 13 million angry Democrats, 13 million angry Republicans.
I think
Okay,
some
Liz
of the
Grant-
people
Oh,
who stay
sorry.
home,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
some of the people who stay home, I think, are those who are put off by all the anger and name calling in politics too. I mean, I hear voters say, or non-voters say, you know, it's dirty business. I am not attracted to either side.
Well, I think that, you know, and I don't think that white baby boomers have the market cornered on anger.
No.
I think that there are a lot of people who are angry in a number of communities, and I think that they have good reason to be. I wrote a column today about city-funded construction projects in Philadelphia. 369 projects they looked at that had a budget over $250,000. 160 of those projects had no minority participation at all, right? So in other words, we're paying our tax money. This is tax dollars, right, being spent on these projects, and we can't get the jobs. There's something wrong with that, and so a lot of my listeners feel like they've been sold out by the Democratic Party, that they can't go over to the Republican Party because of some of the racist language that they have used, but they feel like, you know, the left wing and the right wing are two wings on the same bird, right? And it's the same thing, and it's kind of borne out by this Reuters poll that just came out that showed that about half of Donald Trump voters think that black people are unintelligent, lazy, criminal, etc., but that about a third of Democratic voters think the same thing, right? And so, you know, where do we go, right? And so there's this anger, I think, in my community around the political process, period, because we're tired of platitudes from the Democrats and tired of the racist rhetoric from the Republicans. And so I don't think you guys are the only ones that are angry. We can all hold hands and be angry together.
I'll just add that I spent February as a surrogate for Carly Fiorina, and then I also worked and canvassed for her in New Hampshire in that primary. And I remember one of the polling places where I was standing, I was speaking to a Hillary Clinton supporter who was bemoaning the fact that her dearest friends were deciding between whether they were going to vote for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And to her, it was confounding, but in reality, it shouldn't be that confounding because both candidates resemble what I think voters yearning for solutions without the details want. And I remember an early, an acquaintance of mine who is an early adopter, Donald Trump supporter. I was trying to understand her incredible support. And she said, Farah, all the other candidates are like the Peanuts parents. Wah, 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 wah. That's all I hear when they talk. They give me too many details. They don't just tell me they're going to solve it. I don't want the details. Donald Trump says, I'm going to fix it. I believe him. And Bernie Sanders pretty much says the same thing on the other side of the aisle.
Time for one more question, and we've got a great one. I love this question. Voter anger is the failure of our educational system and the way we have learned. We are now governed by our emotions rather than our reason. Can this be resolved?
Can I just say, I so admire the Rendell Project. So I hope you'll take this question, because the civics, someone who's very involved in education in Philadelphia, civics is missing. And as a result, I don't think people really understand the political process, and yet they're going out and voting. And I think the work that Governor Rendell is doing is incredibly important.
Well, thanks, Farah. And I think that question is really susceptible to two answers. One, we don't spend enough time talking to our kids about civics, and if we do it, we start in the 9th grade, too late. What the judge and I have started is a 501c3 for civics education, and we're doing it in elementary schools. And it's amazing. If you talk to the kids about stuff, it's amazing how seriously they'll take it and how they'll get into it, and they want to learn. And we're missing a bet for not explaining. One of the things we're doing at Political Fest in the convention, and I apologize, I won't be able to go to the wine and cheese because I have meetings on the convention. We have 21 days until our part of the convention opens the Friday before the convention, and I've got meetings tonight. But Political Fest is having a component where we actually teach kids about civics and how the Electoral College works and how the nominating process works. And we're getting boys and girls clubs, PAL centers. We're bringing them in for free to Political Fest, and they're going to be taught by the Rendell Center teachers. We're going to have maps showing the Electoral College, and that's important, and that is important. And we've got to imbue our kids about civics at the earliest age, get them revved up about it. You can make change happen. Tell them about all the times when young people did make a difference. They almost made a difference with Bernie Sanders this time. So that's important. But how to get people not to vote their emotions and vote reason, I think that's a much harder fish to fry. And I think part of the responsibility does lie with the media. Why did the media put Donald Trump on 99 times more than Lindsey Graham or Carly Fiorina? Because he boosted ratings. We've somehow got to get ratings out of the political process. Somehow. I don't know how to do it.
I have to say in response that the media is not just one thing, and that you're basically talking about cable television, a business I'm not in. So I'd just like to make that clear.
I will say this at the risk of losing my lucrative job as a sports reporter for the Daily News. But if you looked at the coverage that Donald Trump got versus Lindsey Graham, even before the first primary, so don't tell me Lindsey Graham didn't get many votes, that's why they stopped covering him, you'll see a huge disparity. It wasn't just
I went with Lindsey
TV.
Graham to New Hampshire, so.
Well, the one thing I got to say about people voting by emotion,
We're
people
taking this over. We're going to stay for another
Exactly.
half hour.
We're never leaving. People do all kinds of stuff based on emotion. One of the wisest women who ever lived, Maya Angelou, said that people won't remember what you said. They won't remember what you did, but they will always remember how you made them feel. And that's the basis upon which people vote, and it'll always be that way.
It's true.
Thank you. This is clearly a conversation that could go on till midnight and beyond. Unfortunately, we don't have the space that long. So I want to right now, and I know that everyone in our audience wants to thank our moderators, John and Dan, and all of our panelists so much for their insight and sharing their time, and Michael for your featured speech to kick everything off. We will continue this conversation out on the deck with our wine and cheese in just a few minutes. And of course, we will be continuing to cover the issues for you in the Inquirer and the Daily News and on Philly.com. Just so you know that while the DNC is in town, our newspapers are going to have special sections every day devoted to everything that's going on with the convention. We will, of course, have reporters in Cleveland for the RNC as well, and they're really coming up quickly. So we want to make sure that you check our papers and our website every day. One more time, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Independence Visitor Center, Liberty View Ballroom here, and Brule Catering. Thank you so much for your time, for all of our panelists, and thank you all for coming tonight. And now we can enjoy the rest of our evening and a little wine and cheese and more discussion.